Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to go over chapter 10. We're going to do a little review. So chapter 10 has been about innovations and inventions. Um, and we started off on page 148. We talked about canals, how important the canal systems were to the early Americans. We talked about the Erie Canal. In 1825, Governor DeWitt Clinton of New York officially opened the Erie Canal, right, which linked the Hudson River with Lake Erie. Many considered the Erie Canal to be the engineering marvel of the 1820s, right? So we talked about the fact that canals united the Northeast and Midwest. And over the next 20 years, canal fever swept through the North and the Midwest. By 1840, more than 3,000 miles of canals have been constructed. We talked about steamboats. So transportation in general begins to advance, right? We talked about the prosperity of New Orleans. Much of that had to do with these steamboats. We talked about those clipper ships. The clipper ships were part of the golden era of sail, the 1840s and the 1850s, right? These clipper ships were graceful. They were narrow-hulled vessels that clipped across the waves with their tall masts and huge sails. The problem was you couldn't load a whole lot on them. They were fast, but they had their negative points as well. Then we talked about the iron horse, the trains, the railroads, which totally changed transportation. So you could now transport things by water or by rail. And so what I want you to do is I want you to look at that section 10.1 review. So for the next day or two, we're going to be reviewing section 10 because we're going to be taking a test on section 10 on Thursday. So you have today, the rest of today to look over section 10 and get ready for the test on Thursday. So we also talked about new machines on the farm. We talked about new ways to plow. John Deere began to experiment with a new metal called steel, which was stronger than iron. At one point, Deere could even afford to buy the steel he needed for his experiments. At one point, Deere could not afford to buy the steel he needed for his experiments. He had to use old discarded saw blades instead. But he persisted, and his persistence paid off. In the 1830s, John Deere patented the steel plow, right? So brand new ways to plow fields, new ways to harvest. A young boy, Cyrus McCormick, had helped his father work on a machine that would reap grain. Their hard work was rewarded in 1831 when the 22-year-old Cyrus developed a reaping machine that made it easier to cut grain, right? We talked about factories, the development of factories. Because New England's cold climate and rocky soil better suited the region to factories, inventors soon found ways to develop the region's abundant water power. In the early 1800s, Francis Cabot Lowell improved the power loom for the rapid weaving of cotton cloth and harnessed the water power of nearby rivers to run his factories, right? So now we see the first factories opening up. We talked about patents, right? They found a way to protect people's intellectual rights, protected their inventions from people stealing them. Talked about the invention from Elias Howe, who invented a much improved sewing machine that could be applied to both cloth and leather goods. And so what we see in the 19th century is this explosion of innovation, right? An explosion of innovation. We saw advancements in mining and steel. Things like the miner's safety lamp was developed, and which made coal miners more at ease that they had this safety lamp. And we talked about the fact that at this point in time, there is a famine in Ireland, and there are a lot of Irish people migrating to America. Section 10.3, we talked about improvements in communications. We talked about the Pony Express, which was the way that mail was delivered. We talked about Samuel F.B. Morse, who invented the telegraph. the transatlantic cable, where they were trying to lay a cable underneath the ocean to connect Europe with the United States. And that failed initially, and they eventually did get that going. Again, all these things happening in the 19th century. We also talked about advances in medical science. The Blackwell sisters, who were amongst the first female physicians. We talked about improvements in hygiene and more comforts at home as technology began to increase, new sources of light and heat, and essentially the idea that science could be applied to invent new things and come up with solutions to everyday problems. So that is section 10. There's not a lot here. So what I want you to do is I want you to do 1 through 14 on page 158. I want you to give me an idea of who these people were. DeWitt Clinton, Robert Fulton, Samuel Clemens, John Deere, Cyrus McCormick, Francis Cabot Lowell, Elias Howe, Isaac Merritt Singer, Samuel F.B. Morse, Matthew Maury, Cyrus Field, Crawford Long, William Morton, Horace Wells, and Elizabeth Blackwell. I want you to tell me who these people are. 1 through 14. That will be your history assignment for today.